Dedication for all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael, and that there should be peace in the world, and cures for illnesses, and end to Corona.
Amen.
Amen. Could have said that about 3 years ago. It would have been better, but still.
Okay, here we go. Continuing with the partnering or employing non-Jews to work on Shabbos. Okay, let me just find. It goes into a lot of detail here. Okay, here we go. If a Jew formed a partnership with a non-Jew to sell merchandise in a store, each partner can take back his share of the merchandise, thereby dissolving the partnership. They can create the partnership anew, this time stipulating properly at the outset. If they took a joint contract to work land, they can dissolve the partnership by waiving their mutual obligations and then join together once again, this time stipulating at the outset. Okay, that's a bit... Okay, a Jew may consign money to a non-Jewish investor, even though the non-Jew will be doing business with his money on Shabbos. The Jew and the non-Jew may split all of the profits from this investment evenly. This is because in this arrangement, the work is not incumbent on the Jew to say that the non-Jew is doing the Jew's work in his stead. Also, people cannot tell to whom the money belongs. Okay, let's just do two quick ones here, two quick sentences. A Jew may hire a non-Jew to sell merchandise for him for a project-based wage, provided that he does not instruct him to sell it on Shabbos. And lastly, if a Jew took a commercial oven as collateral from a non-Jew, and then allowed the non-Jew to keep the oven and operate it with the understanding that the non-Jew will pay whatever revenue the oven generates to the Jew in lieu of interest of the loan, he may take the money earned on Shabbos. This is because the oven remains in the non-Jew's possession. The Jew doesn't really own it at all.
The source in Kalim, where a buyer challenged Rav Yosef. So the Gemara in Kalim in chapter 26, verse 8, discusses a matter that in order for an object other than a person or a food to become tameh through contact with the source of tumah, it must be classified as a kli, as a utensil. In other words, something that's fashioned into a useful form and designated for use in that form. So what we discussed yesterday is even clothing can be seen as a utensil, because utensil just means has utility for use. Okay? And what does that mean is that a raw material that requires processing before it can be used as a utensil is not susceptible to tumah. Now, when I learned this, it was a chiddush to me. I didn't know such a thing. So at times, though, a raw material can be rendered a utensil and be susceptible to tumah by mere thought on the part of its owner without any processing. So, for instance, if the owner of an animal hide intends to make use of it for shoes, it's not susceptible for tumah until he fashions the hide into shoes, because the shoes have to still be processed in order to be wearable and be recognizable in a functional form. But if the owner of an animal hide decides to use the hide in its present state as a mat, where a person can wipe their feet, etc., in other words, it's fit in its present state in terms of requiring no further processing, then immediately, as far as that's concerned, his intent, his mental intent, his machshava alone immediately elevates the hide to the status of a utensil and renders it susceptible to tumah. Okay? Now, only a definitive thought on the part of the legal owner is effective in establishing an item as a utensil. So what we also learn is that there's certain cases, so you might say to me, well, what about a person that sees an animal hide and decides to use it as a mat, but it's not finished because it's not being trimmed? So we don't consider processing something for aesthetics. In other words, a mat might look ugly coming from a hard to wipe your feet on, but it's perfectly functional. So that's fine. If you're doing further processing where you're making it look good, that's not considered enhancing the utility, Gavin. It's considered merely making it more aesthetically pleasing. And so it's considered processed. So if something is processed at the point where you designate it for use, at that point your thought has power, but not if it still requires further processing. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. So what we learn here is we're going to go into the Mishnah specifically, because if you have a look, is that this Mishnah states, in the case of an animal hide of a householder, thought renders them susceptible to tumah. Okay. But, and this is the important thing, generally a householder doesn't sell his hides. Rather, it's his decision. So he makes them into a bed spread, for example, a tray. A tray means you just have to put a bit of wood around it and you can carry things with it, or boards for personal use. You can use it as a mechitza to separate rooms. So his decision not to process a hide further, but to designate it for a use that requires no further processing, is definitive. And it renders it susceptible to tumah. That's Rashi's explanation. But if we're going to contrast that, we need to read the rest of the Mishnah, which says, in the case of the hides of a tanner, thought does not render them susceptible to tumah. And the reason being is that if I am a craftsman and somebody comes to me, I could in my head say, like, I'd like to make the hide, animal hide, a mat. But whatever my preference is, as Arthur quite rightly said last night, it doesn't matter, because the first rule of sales is you don't keep stock inventory of something a customer might want and you end up with dead stock. What you do is you only fashion it and customize it according to the client's taste once you have an order, because at the point where it's unprocessed, you can pretty much turn it into anything you want and fulfill a customer's needs and make a sale much quicker. So as a result, what we learn is that the tanner, or the owner of that little business, has no say in his mind as to what the object could be, because he could say, I want it to be a mat, and I could turn around and go to that tanner and say, you see that hide on the wall? I want that into a pair of shoes. And if he wants to make 2,000 Rand, he's going to say, yes, sir, I'll turn it into shoes, come next week. So what we learn is that a tanner cannot make decisions that can render utensil effective. Only the customer can, and therefore it's not susceptible by tumah by thought. But a homeowner is using it for himself, and therefore his thought, if it requires no further processing, can designate it as a utensil, and therefore that utensil is susceptible to tumah if he's a zav. Okay, so now we're going to go on with the Mishnah, and it's going to add 2 points. And it says, but in the case of hides of a thief, thought renders them susceptible to tumah. So what do we mean there? Is that basically, let's just go through the order of things as far as that's concerned. So I have a hide, so an animal hide, okay? And it got stolen from me from a thief, and that particular thief waited a sufficient time for me to give up ever hopes of recovering that article, and therefore, since I despaired of recovering it, it now belongs to the thief. Now, if he's caught and he goes to court, Kevin, I thought you'd love that. I did that specially for you. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So, in that particular case, the worst case that happens to him, Kevin, is he pays the financial equivalent, since the despair means the thief now owns the actual article, and then he pays a penalty equivalent to the value of the original item as a slap on the knuckles. Okay? Now, Rabbi is of the opinion, and many poskim, that if the article remains intact, you have to return the original article. But in this particular case, the thief's thought actually can make it susceptible to tumah. So the thief steals the heart from me. He waits a few weeks. I give up hope of getting it. It now is acquired by the thief. So therefore, despair by the original owner invokes an acquisition by the thief for the article. So, and he has to pay the financial equivalent and the penalty. And now that he owns it, if he's thinking that animal heart can become a mat, since already processed, a heart and a mat is the same thing. You don't need any further processing apart from trimming and aesthetics, but functionally it's the same. His thought can render that a useful article. And therefore, if he's a Zav, Gavin, if he's a Zav, guys, I need you to concentrate a little bit, not do other things. If he's a Zav, he can make that definitive article susceptible to tumah. But if the thief stole a heart and wishes to make it shoes, only at the point where the shoes are finished and it becomes useful is it susceptible to tumah. Okay? As far as that's concerned. But the Mishnah carries on and it says that that's as far as the thief is concerned, but in the case of the hearts of the robber, thought does not render them susceptible to tumah. Okay? Now the reason being is that even though robber designated the hearts for use that requires no further processing, in other words, he sees an animal heart and wants it as a mat, they don't become susceptible to tumah because we presume that the owner does not despair of recovering them. Rather, since he knows who robbed him, he will sue him in court to recover the stolen article. That's the explanation by Rashi. So since the robber is not the legal owner of the hearts, because the original owner hasn't given up hope of redeeming them, they cannot be susceptible to tumah. So while in the case of a robber, does the Tana Kamma say that the original owner hopes to recover them? Because a thief comes in and steals something, and you don't know who that thief is. His identity has not been revealed. When somebody comes and robs you, you know who that person is, and therefore you haven't given up hope of being able to take him to court since you can identify him and recovering your stolen item. If you haven't given up hope, the person that stole from you cannot acquire it from despair and he has to return the original article. Rabbi Shimon.
Can I ask,
yes.
Damon, before you continue? So I just thought of something that I think is quite clever, but I mean, I think it's something how it applies. But you might have seen it because you read ahead as well. Is if the animal improves, right? So and the guy despairs, so ownership transfers to that guy. Can he give that? Let's say it's an ox, and he took it when it was. What's the baby? Let's say it was a lamb when he took it. What's a young lamb?
A lamb becomes a ram. A lamb
becomes a ram. Yeah. So he bought it was a lamb, it becomes a ram, and then he modifies it, he puts steroids, everything, and he pumps it up, right? And it becomes this huge prize bull type of thing, or whatever, prize ram. Back to the owner, and then the owner actually pays him money. Be interesting that.
Okay, so we did deal with it. I don't want to go too much off topic, but let me answer your question. So
did you deal with it? I apologize.
No, it's fine. We did deal with it. What we said is the natural sexual development of the animal that would have occurred anyway, the thief doesn't get recompensated for. But if he fattened the animal up past the point of what would be considered a natural endocrinological evolution for the animal, in other words, instead of the animal being sexually mature and an adult, at weighing 300 kilograms, it weighs 400 kilograms. We repay the thief for the extra 100 kilograms where he was overly good to the animal. But that was with regards to a physical change.
So who pays that? The owner?
The original owner, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm saying if a physical change takes place, so the original owner, if he still wants that property, has he got the option to take the property, or he doesn't have that option?
So what happens?
Is it up to him, or is it up to the thief?
So what happens is, if it's worth 400 zuz, and that extra 100 kilograms was worth another 60 zuz, then the original owner would only have to compensate him for the 400 zuz minus 60, which would be 340 zuz. So his extra expenditure, it's not what the animal is now worth. It's an extra expenditure of food he paid, not what the animal is worth now. So it would be.
So you pay for the extra food, the extra difference.
I'm guessing. I don't think you would necessarily pay for that weight. I could be wrong, but either way, the thief is compensated for his generosity, and the original owner hasn't lost. Why? Because think about this. What would happen then is the penalty payment would be what the animal was worth at the time of theft. Okay, of fourfold for an ox and fivefold for a sheep. So the original owner has more than compensated for the extra benefits, believe me. So whatever the thief gained, the original owner gained even more, because the penalties, Gavin, make him very well off.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's the extra weight of the animal at what it's valued at on the retail market or not. We know that price fluctuations are dealt with. There was a whole discussion on rubber, if it's dealt with at the time of theft or if it's dealt with at the time of the court hearing. But that, we're going off topic. That's when a physical change takes place. Now we're talking about an issue of despair and about is the thief that happens to be a Zav, can he transmit Tumah to the article or not? And it depends if an acquisition has taken place by either a physical change or despair of the original owner. So I just want to go back on track. But and say to you that Rabbi Shimon has an opposite opinion to the Tanna Kamma. So Rabbi Shimon says, as far as a robber is concerned, because the Tanna Kamma said with the thief, the thought renders them susceptible to Tumah, because you don't know who stole it, so you're not going to be able to have a court case. Therefore, you gave up hope. Therefore, it becomes the thief. And therefore, if he's a Zav with Tumah and he designate the animal hide as a mat, it's susceptible to Tumah because he gave up. He doesn't know who the thief is. A robber, you can see which person robbed. You can identify them, and there's a court hearing. So you haven't given up hope. There's no despair. There's no acquisition by the robber. Rabbi Shimon puts it the opposite way around to the Tanna Kamma. And what he says it's the other way around. With the robber, the robber can never make his thought make the article susceptible to Tumah. Why? Because the original owner, if he was held up with an AK-47 with a band of thieves, even if you know who they are, you're never going to prosecute this mafia guy. You're going to end up, that person's going to end up dead. This is a person that's brazen against the law, not fearful of the law, and therefore you've given up despair as far as a robber's concerned, and therefore a robber can infect it with Tumah as a Zav because despair affects acquisition, and you're not going to prosecute the robber. So again, the Tanna Kamma says a thief, you don't know who that person is. And since you give up despair, the thief then acquires it. And if he's caught legally, he has to pay back financial compensation in the principal amount. But since he now owns it, his thought renders it susceptible to Tumah if an animal hide is already in a state of process to become a mat. It's not like shoes. But a robber, you don't give up hope, according to the Tanna Kamma, because you know who stole from you and you can sue them in court and get your heart back. So the robber never acquires the article and therefore his thought can never make it susceptible to Tumah. That's the Tanna Kamma. Rabbi Shimon says the opposite. Rabbi Shimon says as far as the robber is concerned, he does acquire the hide because of the despair of the original owner, because no one is going to dare take a gang of thieves to court that are above the law who robbed this person with an AK-47, because they'd be terrified. And since, therefore, you give up despair of recovering it through the court system because you're dealing with mafia guys here or gangsters, then it becomes the robber. He only has to, if you manage to get money out of him, pay financial compensation, but he keeps the original item. And as a result, since he has the item, if he's a zav, and he wants the animal hard to become a mat, which is already considered processed, a mat and a hard is the same thing, his thought can render the article useful as a utensil. And from that point, that article can become susceptible to tumah if the robber is in a state of tumah because he's a zav. But with a thief, a thief does, in fact, not acquire, according to Rabbi Shimon, the heart, because say you had somebody come, you had 9 or 10 people come over to you on Pesach, okay? Your friends, they got a bit drunk on Purim. One of the people that rocked up at your house stole your bottle of whiskey, or stole the heart as a joke. Maybe they drank a bit much or whatever. Now, Arthur, you've got the list of people that rocked up to your place. If you find each of them and say, listen, the heart went missing. I know you just did it as a practical joke. I know you're not a thief. You might have drank a bit too much. Can you please bring it back to me? Probably you'll get it back. If you know that it wasn't that case, but somebody stole, but with the case of somebody stealing, you've got the domestic worker that says this person was in your house. You know, if you took a person that is scared to steal in front of you, is scared of the law, he's a jittery person, he's not overly confident, he's a normal citizen, he's not as brazen as a gangster with an AK-47. If you take him to court, the court system would work against somebody like that because he would appear in court because he's not a gangster that's above the law. And since you don't despair of not getting your article back because you know you have got a method of recovery within a court system for a normal citizen that steals something in secret because he's scared of the law, this is a person you can sue. And therefore, since you can sue, you don't despair of having recovered the article. And therefore, the thief doesn't acquire it because you did not despair. And therefore, since he didn't acquire it, his thought cannot change an animal hide into a mat, and therefore it's not susceptible to tumah. So in other words, Rav Shimon and the Tanna Kamma actually agree that despair affects acquisition from the very fact. So Rav Shimon and the Tanna Kamma agree that basically despair affects acquisition. The only thing that they argue about is that whether or not it's a thief or a robber. But both agree with the principle that if the original owner despairs of having recovered the article back, the person that took it, the larcenist, actually gets to acquire the article and therefore it becomes susceptible to tumah. So the essence here is not teaching that thought can, on already processed article or ready for use, can make it susceptible to tumah. The whole point we brought it up in this Mishnah is to prove that despair affects acquisition. So both the Tanna Kamma and Rabbi Shimon agree. They just don't agree in terms of if it's a thief or a robber. But the principle they agree with. Okay. Guys, any questions before we move on?
Perfect from my side.
Okay. So now Rav Yosef responds to Abaye, because this was a challenge that Abaye had to Rav Yosef. And he said, what are we dealing with here in the Mishnah? We are dealing with a case in which the thief or robber trimmed the hearts. So he's saying that when the Mishnah states that the larcenist thought renders the heart susceptible to tumah, it actually refers to whether he trimmed the heart and then decided not to process it further but to use it as is. So the physical change made by the trimming in conjunction with the owner's despair affects acquisition. Despair alone, however, does not affect acquisition. That's according to Rav Yosef. So now we found that Abaye says something different. Abaye says that despair affects acquisition, but Rav Yosef says no. Despair doesn't affect acquisition on its own. It has to work in conjunction with a physical change. Okay. So Tosfot, that was according to the explanation by Rashi. But Tosfot explains that although physical change alone, if you do it the other way around, there's a physical change without despair, that affects acquisition. But he says, Tosfot, that trimming doesn't constitute a full-fledged physical change because it's only aesthetic. So it's only in conjunction with the victim's despair that acquisition is effected. So let's just see the difference between Rashi and Tosfot. Tosfot says either way that a physical change and despair are needed both in order to effect acquisition. That's Tosfot's explanation of Rav Yosef. Rashi's explanation of Rav Yosef is that a physical change without despair can effect acquisition, but as far as despair alone, that doesn't affect acquisition without a physical change. Does that make sense, guys? It's very straightforward.
Just repeat that last line. It doesn't without physical change? Who was that guy that said that? I just want to,
okay,
any other full sentence.
So they're trying to explain Rav Yosef. There's Rashi and Tosfot. So basically, Tosfot says that as far as a physical change alone, even without despair, it affects acquisition. But he says, if you look at this particular case of an animal heart becoming a mat, that doesn't constitute a full-fledged physical change. Because if you look at it, a mat, for example, it's the same as a heart. It's ready for use. So therefore, if you trim it, it's only aesthetics, but it's still as functional. So that sort of physical change, when it's only aesthetic, doesn't affect acquisition. It's not enough to change the article's usage. So in that case, it would need despair in conjunction with it of the original owner to both of those factors to affect acquisition. But Tosfot is saying if there's a significant physical change where from being useless or a raw material becomes processed, that's enough to affect acquisition. Rashi is saying something slightly different than Rav Yosef. He's saying that the physical, that thought renders the heart susceptible to tumah. It's only when there's a physical change in conjunction with the owner's despair that affects acquisition. Because Rashi is explaining that Rav Yosef says despair alone never affects acquisition. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So it's Rav Yosef and Tosfot and Rashi that are involved here.
Yeah, so basically it's Rashi's explanation on Rav Yosef and it's Tosfot's explanation on Rav Yosef. So in other words now, so what happened here is a buyer attacked Rav Yosef. And then Rav Yosef turns around because a buyer is trying to prove to Rav Yosef that in fact despair does affect acquisition, and he's using the Gemara and Kalim. So Rav Yosef is now responding and he says, listen, I don't hold by that, because what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with the case where the thief or robber trimmed the hearts. So what he's saying is, I'm saying here that it's not the case, because it has to be a case when there's a physical change that also in conjunction with the despair that would affect the acquisition, but not despair alone. So that's Rav Yosef's response to a buyer. Okay. Now, the Gemara objects. Why does it object? Rav Hanan objected. He said, but it's not so that the Mishnah is teaching here about a tray. So what's this issue about a tray? I'm going to go through it now. And a tray does not require trimming. So what we are saying is a tray is exactly the same as a mat, is that when you designate a heart for use as a tray, it's rendered susceptible to tumah, whether you trim it or not, because the trimming is only done for aesthetic purposes, the same as a mat. So it's also considered a utensil and almost a finished product and susceptible to tumah even without the trimming. Okay, so where do we get this concept of a tray? And how do we know that the Mishnah refers to a tray, as the Gemara says? For we learnt in the preceding Mishnah, wherever further processing is not lacking, thought renders it susceptible to tumah. But wherever further processing is lacking, thought does not render it susceptible to tumah. So as we explained here, guys, with the case of shoes, you can think about shoes all you want, but if it doesn't resemble shoes, it's not a practical utility that you can put on your feet to walk with. So your thought doesn't mean anything because you still have to do the work. But when it's ready for use, your thought says, do I process it into something else? Or do I use it for the minute it's processed and now you're focusing on what you're using it for, it's susceptible to tumah. But not something that requires further processing like shoes. So again, we learned in the preceding Mishnah, wherever further processing is not lacking, thought renders it susceptible to tumah, but where further process is lacking, thought does not render it susceptible to tumah, except in the case of a tray. Why? Because, as we learned, that although it lacks the trimming, the thought to leave it as it is and use it in its present untrimmed state as a tray renders it susceptible to tumah, because a tray is like a mat. Even if you're doing some slight odd alteration, it's only for the beauty factor, for the aesthetics. But practically, you can use it because it doesn't affect the usage of it. It's like a mat. Whether I rub my feet on a mat or carry something with a tray, if it's an ugly tray or pretty tray, that processing is just for looks, but it's not for utility. And therefore, that's considered fully processed already. Okay? So the assumption is that the succeeding Mishnah continued to use the theme of the previous one with the mat, and in this case uses the example of a tray. According to the Mishnah's ruling that a thief's thought renders a heart susceptible to tumah, it pertains even to where the thief did not trim the heart. So evidently, guys, the thief's acquisition is affected by despair alone, which contradicts Rav Yosef. Okay, so we're going to learn about how Rav Yosef is going to answer this with a backing of Rava. Let's see how many minutes we've got left. We've got time, guys. Okay, hang on. So Rava now responds, and Rava challenged Rav Yosef with this problem for 22 years, and it was not resolved until Rav Yosef, upon the death of Rava, sat at the head of the academy and resolved it as follows. Okay, so what happened was as follows, is that Rava headed the academy of Pumbedisa. Pumbedisa was, I think it was out of Eretz Yisrael. It must have been near Babylonia for 22 years. And then he was succeeded upon his death by Rav Yosef. So Rava was obviously in charge of, and then Rav Yosef took over. Now Rava had been unusually sharp and analytical, and he was known as the uprooter of mountains, whereas Rav Yosef was known for his great breadth and knowledge of the Tanaic and Amoraic teachings, rather than for his sharpness. It's not saying that he wasn't smart. It was just saying that it was difficult for him to deal with this question of Rava, why Rava was a Rav, because Rava was a Mozart. He was a genius. And there, when he took over as Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Yosef received heavenly assistance, divine assistance in resolving this certain long-standing difficulties so that his reputation would be enhanced. So when Hashem chose Rav Yosef as the new leader, he gave him Ruach HaKodesh to resolve these issues, and he resolved it as follows. A change of name is the same as physical change. So just as the physical change in a stolen article affects acquisition by a thief, so does it change in the article's name. Okay? So in other words, if it was originally called a hard and now it's called a mat, that name affects acquisition. It was a hard and now it's called a tray. So that does count, not just a physical change, but a name change. We'll go through it. Guys, I hope the share has been good.
Very good. Thank you.